The war in Vietnam by 1967 has evolved into a grinding conflict, characterized by countless small unit engagements scattered across the country's diverse terrain, each one representing a tactical situation where American forces seek to locate and engage an elusive enemy, while that enemy attempts to inflict casualties and avoid decisive battle. The experiences of units such as Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and Delta Company, 5th Battalion, 7th Cavalry, illustrate the nature of combat that has become typical in this war, where traditional concepts of front lines and rear areas have little meaning, and where danger can materialize suddenly during operations that begin as routine patrols or security missions. These small unit actions, often involving platoons or companies operating independently or as part of larger sweeps, accumulate into the broader pattern of combat operations that define the American military experience in Vietnam during this period. The firefights that occur daily across South Vietnam rarely achieve strategic significance individually, yet collectively they shape the course of the war through their cumulative impact on casualties, unit cohesion, and the psychological toll on soldiers who must maintain constant vigilance against an enemy who chooses when and where to fight. The tactical situation near the village of Phuoc Ninh, where Bravo Company encounters enemy forces during what begins as a routine patrol, reflects conditions common throughout the operational areas where American forces conduct search and destroy missions. The 7th Cavalry Regiment, whose 1st Battalion includes Bravo Company, carries historical significance dating to its origins in the Indian Wars of the 19th century, though by 1967 it has been reorganized and equipped for modern, mechanized, and airmobile operations. The regiment gained renewed attention earlier in 1965 during the Battle of Ia Drang Valley, where elements of the 1st Battalion and 2nd Battalion engaged North Vietnamese Army forces in some of the first major conventional battles between American and North Vietnamese units. That engagement, occurring in November 1965, demonstrated both the effectiveness of American firepower and airmobile tactics and the willingness of North Vietnamese forces to accept substantial casualties while attempting to inflict maximum damage on American units. The lessons from Ia Drang influenced subsequent American tactical doctrine in Vietnam, reinforcing emphasis on rapid reinforcement through helicopter assault, immediate application of artillery and air support when contact occurs, and medical evacuation procedures that prioritize getting wounded soldiers to surgical facilities within the critical first hour after injury. The patrol conducted by Bravo Company outside Phuoc Ninh follows standard procedures developed for operations in areas where enemy presence is suspected but not confirmed. American infantry units in Vietnam typically conduct multiple types of patrols, including reconnaissance patrols designed to gather intelligence about enemy locations and activities, ambush patrols that establish positions along likely enemy routes and wait for targets to appear, and clearing patrols that move through villages and surrounding terrain to search for enemy forces, weapons caches, and evidence of enemy activity. The soldiers move in formations designed to provide security in multiple directions while maintaining the ability to maneuver if contact occurs, with point men advancing ahead of the main body to provide early warning of enemy presence or booby traps. The designation of a point man represents one of the most dangerous positions in a patrol because that soldier moves first into potential ambush sites and has the highest probability of triggering mines or explosive devices. The rotation of soldiers through the point position reflects the recognition that the psychological stress and physical demands of this role require periodic relief, though some soldiers develop particular skills in reading terrain and detecting enemy signs that make them valuable in this position, despite the heightened risk. The moment of contact, when the patrol suddenly encounters enemy forces, initiates a sequence of actions that American soldiers train for repeatedly, but which in actual combat occurs with a speed and chaos that tests both individual skills and unit cohesion. The recognition of enemy soldiers, the exchange of fire that begins within seconds, and the immediate need to take cover while returning fire and communicating the situation to other unit members all occur nearly simultaneously. The training that American soldiers receive before deployment to Vietnam emphasizes immediate action drills for various contact scenarios, with the fundamental principle being that soldiers must respond aggressively and quickly to seize initiative rather than allowing the enemy to control the engagement. The reality of combat, however, often involves confusion about enemy locations and numbers, difficulty distinguishing enemy fighters from civilians in areas where the population includes both, terrain that limits visibility and movement, and the challenge of coordinating unit actions while under fire. The experience described by the soldier who encounters the North Vietnamese Army soldier on the trail captures the sudden nature of close-range combat, where reaction time and immediate aggression often determine survival, with both combatants opening fire simultaneously in circumstances where neither has time for deliberate aim or tactical consideration. The patrol's situation upon making contact, described as being pinned down in an open clearing, represents a tactical disadvantage that enemy forces frequently attempt to create through their choice of ambush locations. An open area provides minimal cover and concealment, leaving soldiers exposed to enemy fire while limiting their options for maneuver. Enemy forces in Vietnam, both Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese Army regulars, demonstrate tactical sophistication in selecting ambush sites that maximize their advantages while providing covered withdrawal routes that enable them to break contact before American reinforcements or supporting fires can be brought to bear effectively. The doctrine developed by Vietnamese Communist forces emphasizes attacking when conditions are favorable and withdrawing when American firepower advantages would make continued engagement costly, a flexible approach that contrasts with the American preference for maintaining contact and using superior firepower to destroy enemy units once located. This difference in tactical approach creates frustration for American commanders who seek decisive engagements but frequently find that enemy forces disperse after brief contact, leaving behind casualties and blood trails, but avoiding the sustained battles where American advantages would be most telling. The call for immediate support, once Bravo Company is engaged, reflects standard procedures and the integrated system of supporting arms that American forces employ in Vietnam. Artillery support, delivered from nearby fire support bases, provides the most rapidly available heavy firepower once contact occurs, with forward observers attached to infantry units trained to calculate coordinates, communicate fire missions, and adjust rounds onto target. The network of fire support bases established throughout American operational areas by 1967 ensures that most locations fall within artillery range, typically extending to 15 kilometers or more, depending on the gun type employed. The fire bases themselves, positioned on hilltops and other defensible terrain, require constant security and supply, creating a significant demand on available forces, but providing the capability to deliver massed fires rapidly when infantry units require support. The artillery fire brought in to support Bravo Company serves multiple functions, including suppressing enemy firing positions to enable American soldiers to maneuver or withdraw inflicting casualties on enemy forces even when visual contact is limited, and demonstrating American firepower capabilities in ways that often convince enemy forces to break contact rather than risk annihilation. The firefight's duration of over an hour represents a longer engagement than typical for many contacts in Vietnam, where enemy forces often fire briefly and then withdraw before American supporting arms can be fully employed. The sustained nature of this engagement suggests either that enemy forces believed they held a significant advantage that might enable them to inflict substantial casualties, that circumstances prevented their easy withdrawal, or that the action served broader tactical or strategic purposes, such as fixing American forces in place, while other enemy units maneuvered elsewhere. Intelligence assessments from this period indicate that enemy forces sometimes accepted higher risks to achieve specific tactical objectives or to maintain pressure on American units even when the immediate tactical situation appeared unfavorable. The psychological impact on American soldiers of sustained firefights should not be underestimated, as the experience of being under fire for extended periods creates stress and fatigue that affects performance and can have lasting effects on mental health. The immediate post-combat period often reveals the emotional toll, with soldiers experiencing reactions ranging from elation at survival to grief over casualties, though during the engagement itself, training and immediate survival instincts typically dominate behavior. The casualties suffered by Bravo Company during the engagement, with 2 Americans killed in action and 7 wounded, represent numbers consistent with the small unit actions that occurred daily throughout Vietnam during 1967. Each American killed represents not only the individual loss, but also the impact on the soldier's family, unit cohesion, and the broader American public's perception of the war as casualty totals accumulate week by week. The wounded soldiers face varying recovery prospects depending on the nature and severity of their injuries, with the rapid medical evacuation system in Vietnam providing the best possible chance of survival, but leaving many with permanent disabilities. The soldier who mentions having received 3 Purple Hearts, the decoration awarded for wounds received in combat, and expressing hope to avoid a 4th, captures the accumulated physical and psychological toll of repeated combat exposure. Military policy during this period allows soldiers who receive 3 Purple Hearts to request reassignment away from combat duties, though not all soldiers exercise this option due to loyalty to their units or reluctance to abandon comrades. The rotation of individual soldiers through 12-month tours in Vietnam, rather than deploying units for the duration of the war, as in previous conflicts, creates both advantages in terms of limiting individual exposure and disadvantages related to constant personnel turnover that affects unit cohesion and institutional knowledge. The arrival of helicopter gunships and medical evacuation aircraft represents the integrated air support system that defines American tactical operations in Vietnam. Helicopter gunships, typically armed with machine guns, rockets, and sometimes grenade launchers, provide close air support that can be delivered rapidly and with precision against targets near friendly forces. The pilots and crews who fly these missions operate under demanding conditions, approaching active firefights at low altitude where they are vulnerable to ground fire, coordinating their attacks to avoid friendly casualties and often remaining on station for extended periods to provide continuous support. The presence of gunships overhead provides both practical suppression of enemy positions and psychological reassurance to ground troops who know that additional firepower is available if needed. Medical evacuation helicopters, designated as medevac or dust-off missions, maintain alert status throughout Vietnam, specifically to respond to casualty evacuation requests, with crews prepared to launch immediately, regardless of conditions or risks. The willingness of these crews to fly into hostile situations to retrieve wounded soldiers creates a bond of trust between air and ground personnel and contributes to the high survival rates achieved for combat casualties in Vietnam. The smoke grenades, used to mark landing zones for medical evacuation, represent standard equipment and procedures refined through experience in Vietnam. Colored smoke provides a visual reference that helicopter pilots can see from a distance, indicating both the landing zone location and wind direction that affects the helicopter's approach. The communication of smoke color by radio before the grenade is ignited serves as a security measure to prevent enemy forces from deploying similar smoke in an attempt to confuse the helicopter and potentially cause it to land in an enemy-controlled area. The rapid loading of casualties onto evacuation helicopters, conducted while the aircraft remains on the ground for the minimum time necessary, reflects both the urgency of getting wounded soldiers to medical facilities and the vulnerability of stationary helicopters to enemy fire. The coordination between ground personnel, who prepare casualties for loading, and air crews, who direct the process, must occur quickly and efficiently despite the noise, rotor wash, and stress of the tactical situation. The enemy casualties from the engagement, described as unconfirmed but suggested by blood trails, illustrate the difficulty of conducting accurate battle damage assessment in Vietnam. Enemy forces typically remove their casualties when possible, both to deny American forces the psychological and propaganda value of confirming enemy losses and to maintain operational security about unit identities and strengths. Blood trails provide circumstantial evidence that enemy soldiers were hit, though they do not confirm whether wounds were fatal or how many individuals were actually casualties. American military reporting during this period often relies on body counts as a metric of success, reflecting the attrition strategy that measures progress by the rate at which enemy forces are destroyed. However, the difficulties in confirming enemy casualties, the incentives created by emphasis on body counts, and the enemy's practice of removing casualties all contribute to uncertainties about the actual effectiveness of American operations. These reporting issues become increasingly controversial as the war continues, and questions arise about whether reported enemy casualties accurately reflect damage inflicted or whether pressure to demonstrate success leads to inflated figures. The characterization of the engagement as another day in a war where the front line is everywhere captures the fundamental nature of combat operations in Vietnam. Unlike conventional wars where front lines separate friendly and enemy territories, the conflict in Vietnam features enemy forces operating throughout South Vietnam, including in areas nominally controlled by the South Vietnamese government or American forces. The insurgency component of the war, with Viet Cong operating within villages and using the population for cover and support, means that distinguishing combatants from civilians presents constant challenges. The infiltration of North Vietnamese army units from border sanctuaries means that even in remote areas where population is sparse, American forces can encounter regular enemy formations. This omnipresent threat creates a tactical environment where soldiers must maintain constant security regardless of location, where routine operations can instantly become combat engagements, and where the psychological stress of constant vigilance accumulates over time. The phrase that no footstep is ever certain reflects the reality of operating in terrain where booby traps, mines, and ambushes can be encountered anywhere, making every patrol and movement operation inherently dangerous. The experience of Delta Company, 5th Battalion, 7th Cavalry, described in the second engagement, illustrates different aspects of small unit combat in Vietnam, particularly the challenges that occur when units suffer casualties in situations where immediate evacuation is prevented by continuing enemy fire. The scenario where an enemy machine gun has killed one soldier and wounded 6 others while occupying a concealed position behind a hedgerow represents a tactical situation that requires careful assessment and response. Machine guns, with their sustained fire capability and longer range compared to rifles, can dominate terrain features and pin down infantry units, preventing movement and inflicting casualties on soldiers who attempt to advance or withdraw. The positioning of enemy snipers on both flanks compounds the tactical problem by creating a crossfire that makes maneuver difficult and dangerous. The decision about how to respond to such situations involves balancing multiple considerations, including the mission objectives, the possibility of additional casualties if aggressive action is taken, the availability of supporting fires or reinforcements, and the morale impact of leaving casualties on the battlefield. The decision by 2nd Platoon to pull back away from the machine gun position represents a tactical response to a situation where remaining in place would likely result in additional casualties without achieving meaningful tactical objectives. Withdrawal under fire requires coordination and fire discipline to enable some soldiers to move, while others provide covering fire, with the constant risk that enemy forces will attempt to increase their rate of fire or maneuver to exploit the withdrawal. The reality that the withdrawal requires leaving behind the body of the soldier killed by the machine gun creates both a practical problem and a deeply emotional situation for the surviving soldiers. American military culture places extraordinary emphasis on recovering casualties, both wounded and killed, with the commitment that no soldier will be left behind, serving as a fundamental principle that maintains trust and cohesion. The practical reasons for recovering casualties include preventing the enemy from capturing identification documents and personal effects, ensuring accurate casualty reporting, and enabling remains to be returned to families. The psychological and moral dimensions, however, often outweigh practical considerations, with soldiers willing to accept significant risks to recover fallen comrades. The fact that most soldiers in the platoon do not remember the name of the killed soldier, described as a private first class, who joined the unit the previous month with red hair and freckles, reflects the realities of individual replacement systems and the constant personnel turnover in Vietnam. Unlike wars where units deployed together, trained together, and developed cohesion over extended periods, the Vietnam-era policy of individual 12-month tours means that soldiers constantly arrive and depart from units, making it difficult to develop the deep bonds that characterize veteran units in other conflicts. New soldiers face particular risks during their first months in country as they learn the specific skills and awareness required for survival in Vietnam's combat environment. Though units attempt to integrate new personnel gradually and provide mentorship from experienced soldiers, the impersonal nature of modern war, combined with the self-protective psychological mechanisms that soldiers develop to cope with constant casualties, can create situations where individuals who have not yet established relationships within the unit remain somewhat anonymous until they have survived long enough to become integrated. The platoon leader's determination to recover the body, despite the tactical risks, suggests either personal values about the treatment of casualties or an understanding that unit morale and trust depend on demonstrating commitment to recovering all casualties regardless of circumstances. The radio communication between the platoon leader and higher headquarters illustrates the tension that sometimes exists between tactical commanders at different levels who may have different perspectives on acceptable risk and mission priorities. The initial instruction to withdraw and leave the body reflects a judgment that recovering remains does not justify the risk of additional casualties, a calculation that from a purely tactical standpoint may be defensible, but which fails to account for the psychological and morale dimensions of leaving a soldier's body on the battlefield. The platoon leader's insistence on conducting the recovery despite these orders reflects either a different assessment of the risks involved or a determination that the impact on his soldiers of abandoning the recovery outweighs the tactical risks. This type of decision represents the complex moral and leadership challenges that junior officers and non-commissioned officers face in combat, where they must balance their responsibilities to accomplish missions and preserve their forces against their duties to individual soldiers and the maintenance of unit cohesion and morale. The military's hierarchical command structure normally requires subordinates to follow orders even when they disagree, though situations occasionally arise where commanders at different levels have legitimately different assessments of what circumstances require. The assessment that the enemy machine gun may no longer be active based on the observation that a fragmentation grenade has been placed in the suspected position and that continued fire has not been observed represents the type of tactical judgment that must be made with incomplete information under time pressure. Fragmentation grenades provide an effective means of neutralizing enemy positions in bunkers, fighting holes, or behind cover where direct fire weapons cannot achieve effects, though confirming the results often requires visual inspection that exposes soldiers to risk. The platoon leader's statement that he will not expose himself unnecessarily while conducting the recovery reflects an understanding that the mission requires calculated risk rather than reckless behavior. Though any movement into an area recently occupied by enemy forces inherently involves substantial danger. The provision of covering fire by the rest of the platoon while the recovery team moves forward serves to suppress any remaining enemy positions and to provide immediate support if contact is renewed, following standard small unit tactics that emphasize mutual support and coordinated action. The recovery of the casualty by the platoon leader, radio operator, and squad sergeant demonstrates the leadership principle that commanders should not ask subordinates to take risks that they themselves are unwilling to accept. The selection of the radio operator to accompany the recovery reflects the need to maintain communication with the rest of the platoon and higher headquarters during the operation, enabling immediate requests for support if needed, and providing real-time information about the tactical situation. The participation of a squad sergeant, a senior non-commissioned officer, brings experience and tactical judgment to the operation while demonstrating leadership by example. The physical task of recovering a casualty under potential enemy observation and fire requires not only courage but also the physical strength to move a body that, equipped with combat gear, typically weighs well over 200 pounds. The use of cover and concealment during the recovery, moving quickly to minimize exposure time while carefully handling the casualty, reflects training and tactical awareness that must be maintained even under the stress of the situation. The characterization that 100 platoons fight 100 small battles in nameless hamlets every week captures the scope and distributed nature of combat operations in Vietnam during 1967. The American force structure deployed to Vietnam by this point includes multiple divisions and separate brigades distributed across the country, each conducting continuous operations within their assigned areas of responsibility. At any given time, dozens of company and platoon-sized units are conducting patrols, ambushes, security operations, and search missions, each with the potential to result in combat. The cumulative effect of these small actions creates the casualty totals that by 1967 are measured in hundreds of Americans killed and thousands wounded each month. Numbers that increasingly concern American political leaders and the public as the war continues without clear progress toward resolution. The phrase "nameless hamlets" reflects the reality that many of these engagements occur in locations that have little strategic significance and that most Americans could not locate on a map. Yet for the soldiers involved, and particularly for those killed or wounded, each action carries life or death consequences. The assessment that the firefight near Phuoc Ninh had little meaning in the grand strategy except for the soldier killed illustrates the tension between strategic objectives and the individual human cost of war. From the perspective of senior military commanders and political leaders, individual small unit actions are evaluated based on their cumulative contribution to broader objectives such as attrition of enemy forces, securing population areas, and demonstrating American resolve. From the perspective of soldiers and their families, each casualty represents an irreplaceable individual loss, regardless of strategic significance. This tension exists in all wars, but becomes particularly acute in conflicts where the connection between tactical actions and strategic objectives is unclear, or where the ultimate outcome does not align with the sacrifices made. The retrospective knowledge that American withdrawal from Vietnam and the eventual fall of South Vietnam in 1975 meant that the tactical successes achieved by units throughout the war did not translate into strategic victory adds complexity to evaluating individual actions, though this should not diminish recognition of the professionalism and sacrifice of soldiers who executed their missions under difficult conditions. The discovery of an additional casualty during the recovery operation, mentioned in the radio communication, suggests the chaotic nature of the engagement and the difficulty of maintaining accurate accountability when units are dispersed under fire. The fog of war, a term describing the uncertainty and confusion inherent in combat operations, often means that immediate understanding of casualties and unit dispositions is incomplete. The request for medical evacuation to pick up the additional body indicates that despite the tactical situation, procedures for casualty handling and evacuation continue even after the immediate fighting has concluded. The processing of casualties, including documentation, identification, and eventual return to families, represents a systematic effort to account for all personnel and to ensure that families receive accurate information and the opportunity to bury their family members. The military's success in accounting for casualties in Vietnam, with a very small percentage remaining missing or unidentified compared to previous wars, reflects improved procedures and the priority placed on casualty recovery and identification. The broader context of American operations in 1967 shows a military force executing its assigned missions professionally while operating within a strategic framework whose assumptions are increasingly questionable. The attrition strategy pursued by General Westmoreland rests on the belief that American firepower and mobility can inflict unsustainable casualties on enemy forces, eventually forcing North Vietnam to negotiate or cease support for the insurgency in South Vietnam. The tactical success of American units in small unit engagements, reflected in favorable casualty ratios when American and enemy forces meet in combat, appears to validate this approach from a purely military perspective. However, several factors undermine the strategy's effectiveness. Enemy forces demonstrate willingness to accept casualties far higher than American planners anticipated, with North Vietnamese leadership viewing the conflict in existential terms where defeat is not acceptable regardless of costs. The enemy's ability to control the tempo of operations by choosing when to engage and when to avoid combat means that American forces cannot maintain the constant pressure required to achieve decisive attrition. The replacement of enemy casualties through continued infiltration from North Vietnam and recruitment in South Vietnam proves sufficient to maintain enemy combat capability despite losses. The political dimension of the war, both in South Vietnam, where government legitimacy remains contested, and in the United States, where public support erodes as casualties mount, creates timelines and constraints that affect military operations. The 7th Cavalry Regiment's units, including both Bravo Company of the 1st Battalion and Delta Company of the 5th Battalion, operate as part of the 1st Cavalry Division, an Airmobile formation specifically organized to exploit helicopter mobility in Vietnam's operational environment. The division's structure emphasizes light infantry formations transported by helicopter, supported by aerial artillery, and enabled by an extensive aviation brigade that provides both transport and attack capabilities. This organizational approach represents a significant innovation in military structure, though it also creates logistical demands for helicopter maintenance, fuel, and parts that strain supply systems. The tactical effectiveness of airmobile operations is demonstrated repeatedly through the ability to concentrate forces rapidly, to reinforce units in contact, and to pursue enemy forces detected by reconnaissance. However, the dependency on helicopters also creates vulnerabilities when weather prevents flight operations, when landing zones are unavailable or under fire, and when enemy forces employ anti-aircraft weapons that threaten aviation assets. The individual soldiers who serve in units like Bravo Company and Delta Company during 1967 represent a cross-section of American society, though not a perfectly representative one, given deferments and exemptions that affect who serves. The draft system in effect during this period requires military service from young men, unless they qualify for various categories of deferment, including educational, occupational, medical, and dependency exemptions. The result is a military force that includes both volunteers who enlisted for various reasons and draftees who serve because they were selected, with tensions sometimes arising from these different motivations. The racial composition of combat units reflects broader American social patterns, including segregation and inequality, with African American soldiers serving in numbers disproportionate to their percentage of the overall population, a disparity that contributes to civil rights concerns and tensions within American society. The training provided to soldiers before deployment to Vietnam has been refined based on combat experience, emphasizing individual skills, small unit tactics, and the specific challenges of combat in Vietnam's environment. Though the complexity of counterinsurgency operations and the political dimensions of the conflict prove difficult to address fully through military training. The experience of combat in Vietnam creates bonds between soldiers who serve together, while also generating stresses and conflicts that reflect the war's challenging nature. The shared experience of danger, the dependence on comrades for survival, and the isolation from the broader society create intense relationships within military units. Simultaneously, the constant personnel turnover caused by individual rotation policies, the tensions between career military personnel and draftees, and the growing awareness of opposition to the war within the United States create divisions and uncertainties. The cultural gulf between American soldiers and the Vietnamese population, combined with the difficulty distinguishing friendly civilians from enemy combatants, contributes to incidents of abuse and atrocities that damage American moral standing, even as the majority of soldiers serve honorably. The availability of drugs and alcohol, combined with the stress of combat and the boredom of periods between operations, creates substance abuse problems that affect unit readiness and individual soldiers. These complex dynamics within the American military force in Vietnam reflect not only the specific circumstances of this war, but also broader social changes occurring in the United States during the 1960s. The tactical lessons learned from engagements like those experienced by Bravo Company and Delta Company contribute to the continuous evolution of American doctrine and procedures during the war. After-action reports compiled following each significant engagement enable systematic analysis of what worked effectively and what problems occurred, leading to adjustments in tactics, techniques, and procedures that are disseminated throughout the force. The emphasis on immediate aggressive response to contact, the integration of supporting fires, and the procedures for medical evacuation all reflect institutional learning from thousands of previous engagements. However, certain fundamental challenges resist solution through tactical adaptation. The enemy's strategic approach of avoiding decisive battle while maintaining pressure through small unit actions proves difficult to counter effectively. The political constraints that prevent American ground operations into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, except in limited cases, allow enemy forces to maintain sanctuaries where they can rest, refit, and train beyond American reach. The challenge of conducting effective counterinsurgency while simultaneously fighting conventional battles against North Vietnamese army units creates competing demands for resources and different operational approaches that are difficult to reconcile. The measurement of progress primarily through enemy casualties rather than political objectives or population security creates metrics that can show favorable trends even when the war's fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. The coming months following October 1967 will demonstrate both the tactical proficiency of American forces and the strategic limitations they face. The Tet Offensive, launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in late January 1968, will involve coordinated attacks throughout South Vietnam, including assaults on major cities, province capitals, and even the American embassy in Saigon. The offensive will be defeated militarily with heavy enemy casualties, yet it will fundamentally alter American public perception of the war by demonstrating enemy capabilities that contradict optimistic official assessments. The aftermath of Tet will lead to policy reconsideration, including the decision not to grant General Westmoreland's request for additional troops, the initiation of peace negotiations, President Johnson's announcement that he will not seek re-election, and the beginning of the gradual American withdrawal that will extend over the next 5 years. The soldiers serving in units like Bravo Company and Delta Company in 1967 could not foresee these developments, instead focusing on the immediate challenges of survival, mission accomplishment, and support for their comrades under conditions of constant danger and uncertainty.